Hey, all right, fantastic. I'm glad that we have sorted out the time and that we could get this debate going. Sweet. So, thanks for debating me tonight. I'm taking the pro side, and that schools should conduct mandatory drug testing on their students. I'll define schools as high schools in the United States, and I'll define mandatory drug testing as carrying out testing on students, for example, in a random drug testing fashion. According to the US site Prevention Not Punishment, the main objectives of drug tests are to deter and prevent drug use, to reinforce all other prevention efforts, and to identify students in need help getting and staying drug free, and also prepare students for real-life workplace drug testing. The test is simple, usually involves urinating in a cup, and then that's tested for drug use. And it is indeed effective. According to the U.S. Department of Education's National Center for Education Evaluation and Regional Assistance, students involved in extracurricular activities and subject to in-school drug testing reported less substance use than comparable students in high schools without drug testing, according to an evaluation released by the Institute of Education Sciences. I argue that mandatory random drug testing on students is effective, shown by the facts, and is also in line with the utilitarianism idea of the greater good. Works as a deterrent. It works to identify students that may need help. And in most cases, when there is drug testing and something is positive, there isn't a huge backlash against the student. They don't have their lives ruined or anything. What happens is there could be something like a suspension, and then counseling and help comes in for the student. And what happens is it's a positive outcome for the student and also for the school, as it becomes more of a drug-free environment. Thank you. Pass the mic. There we go.
All right, so I guess I'll go through your speech first, and then in the next one I can go through some of my arguments. But I'll agree with the definition of high schools as well as drug testing to be implemented with random drug tests. The first thing that you said was the idea that drug testing deters and prevents. And I'll go on this idea later in my contentions. But one of the most important ideas is that drug testing leads to more usage of higher or harder drugs because of the problem that drug testing can only combat softer drugs such as marijuana, but it can't actually stop harder drugs, which is why it doesn't prevent students from using drugs. It just gives them a reason to use harder drugs that aren't detectable. The next idea was the U.S. Department of Education. And specifically in the quote you said that students who had drug testing as well as extracurriculars did better in schools. And that's the biggest distinction in the round, is the idea of drug testing versus extracurriculars. And one of the most important studies found is that students who are involved in extracurriculars have far more reason to stay in school, to stay educated, and have a safer learning environment. And that's going to be a major distinction we're going to have to make. Drug testing is its own separate entity, and so all evidence that you're going to have to provide cannot be included with extracurriculars, which I'm going to say is far more effective than drug testing. So your burden falls on the idea of showing uniquely why drug testing is good. And then you go on to this idea of the greater good, but the problem with that is a school has two jobs. It's to A, make you feel safe, because their fiduciary responsibility is to act as your parent when a child is in high school, and then also is to provide you an education. But two of the main problems that occur when you have mandatory drug testing is something called an SRO, which is a student resource officer, who, according to the U.S. Department of Education, is the only actor that's allowed to implement a drug test. And I'll further to go on why SRO presence within high schools is a bad thing and doesn't promote the greater good. And then also the idea that drug testing unfortunately discriminates against minorities. These students are far more susceptible to be found positive to a drug test, and schools that have majority minority students are more likely to implement more drug tests. And the problem with this is that because of these drug tests, it creates a bad environment within the school where students don't feel safe to learn, which I'll say is a problem with drug testing. But also it means that minority students are far more punished and incarcerated because of drug usage, which leads to Jason Nance's famous school to prison pipeline, which is essentially that idea that when we have drug testing in schools that target minorities, we have far more minority students either being arrested or dropping out. and this directly leads them to being funneled into prison through a series of events. And I think that's one of the most major harms of mandatory drug testing.
Oh, fantastic. Okay. So, just to address sort of your first point of drug testing leads to usage of harder drugs. So according to the National Institute on Drug Abuse, actually urine sample tests do cover things like cocaine, amphetamines, acid, opioids, and some different prescription drugs. So it does actually cover some harder drugs. And you're arguing that extracurriculars are more of a way to keep kids in school. Is that, I'm correct on that? Is that the statement you were making, that extracurriculars are more effective than drug testing? Yeah, so the thing is that drug testing can actually go alongside extracurriculars. So with a lot of schools, you'll find with sports teams that drug testing is a requirement to be a part of the high-level sports team at different schools in the United States. So it actually just kind of goes alongside it, or is partnered with a lot of extracurriculars already. So you still find that it doesn't interfere with it. Of course, extracurriculars should be promoted. That's not what we're arguing here. We're saying that mandatory drug testing should be carried out, and whether that's carried out in cohesion with extracurriculars, in which a lot of cases, or in some cases it already is successfully, that doesn't matter. What matters is that it should be conducted and carried out. I think that my burden really falls on making the case that overall mandatory drug testing is effective morally, also for the greater good. And you were saying that places where there's more minorities, there's more drug testing that's going on. I think that drug testing, mandatory drug testing, should be at every school in the United States. There's no issue of these different equalities or inequalities that are going on. Of course, it can be done more efficiently if it's carried out at every place. Of course, there can be more studies done in how to make it feel like a safer place, I think, for different schools. But it is safer in the end, because what you do is you have this environment where drugs are not as prevalent, and therefore you end up having this safer environment. You have people more engaged, students all the way to parents. And also, when it comes to students testing positive, it's not, the primary purpose is not to punish students. According to Bush's original speech in 2003, that was looking at how to carry this out. And I'll go more into that as we move along. Pass the mic.
All right, so let's start with the first argument, which is drug abuse, harder drugs can be detected by urine sample. So I'll dive in that contention because it needs to be clarified. So I'm not arguing that urine samples can't detect hard drugs, but the problem is the average hard drug, which is either cocaine or ecstasy, stays within the body for 2.7 days. However, marijuana stays in the body on average for 29 days. The problem is, because these are in fact random drug searches, students know if they use marijuana, they're far more likely to be caught in the range of the 29-day period and thus be detected. So the argument found that in 107 surveyed schools that use mandatory drug testing, they found that there was overall on net a 47% increase in hard drug use, because students know they're less likely to be detected with these hard drugs as they have a shorter amount of time in the body as compared to marijuana. And this is problematic because the effects of cocaine are found to be far more severe than that of marijuana. And in the 117 schools surveyed, there were 41 related incidences with cocaine use. So insofar as we find that actual empirical data sets up the idea that the perception that you are far less likely to get caught with a harder drug because directly, uniquely to drug test, find that it creates a harm within the school district. Then we go to this idea of extracurriculars, and I'm not arguing that these two can't go in tandem. The argument is that the average drug testing for a school that implements this is $22,000 per year, according to Christopher Ingram. And this becomes really important because a lot of schools in the United States of America, specifically public schools, which are more likely to implement this resolution, are at a loss of funding. And this is a really big distinction, because the amount of funding that goes towards drug testing on average finds that for every $3,000 spent on drug testing, there's only one positive test. which is really 1 in 125 actually come back positive. But the lump sum of $22,000 a year could go towards funding 8 different extracurriculars, as found by Joy DeFrus of the New York Times. So insofar as we have a weighing of impacts in this round, we find that if we implement mandatory drug testing, we are spending on average $22,000 that's not going towards extracurriculars. And that becomes a problem because she furthers in her study that extracurriculars to students decrease the amount of likelihood of dropping out by 57%. It decreased the amount of likelihood to use drugs by 49%, decreased the amount of likelihood to become teen parents by 37%, and students are 27% less likely to get arrested when extracurriculars are prevalent in a school. So insofar as what this comes down to is you have to show the empirical benefit of mandatory drug testing and not just saying it does good. Because I show you that when this money goes towards extracurriculars, it creates a far better atmosphere.
Fantastic. So first, I'll try and adjust a few of your points and then go into more of what President Bush said in actually 2001, excusing me for using the wrong word in the last round. You were talking about how they were using harder drugs because they were able to sort of get around these longer lasting drugs that would be tested and then found positive. Well, this, I think, actually solidifies my case. Drug testing should happen and should happen more because if there's mandatory drug testing going on, and especially in a random sporadic fashion, what you're going to find is people will start using even the harder drugs less if this is happening more, if there's more of this going on. And then adjusting the $22,000 a year, I'll run with that fact. And I think what that addresses is a larger education problem in regards to the United States as a whole. I think that included in my argument is the fact that there needs to be provision of funds for this mandatory drug testing. And the United States is definitely not one of the top education places in the world, actually towards the end of the developed countries. And I can provide evidence for that in the next round. But there should definitely be more allocation of funds to provide for this mandatory drug testing that will tackle things like the harder drugs and the longer lasting drugs to make a drug-free environment in schools. And it should happen in all schools in an address to your argument of inequality and only at minority schools. So on May 10, 2001, President George Bush set out a 2-year goal of reducing drug use in youth by 10% and a 5-year goal of reducing it by 25%. In his January 2004 State of the Union address, he expressed a strong support for random student drug testing and mandatory drug testing and increased spending on student drug testing programs. Recent data show that the 2-year and 5-year goals were met, and this random drug testing is part of that story. Of course, this is in the past, but this issue is not in the past. This issue is present right now in the United States, and that's why we're arguing it. There needs to be more done, and mandatory drug testing is a way of carrying that out across all public schools in the United States. And just to go into what happens when a student tests positive, the positive test is verified by a medical review officer. I think something that you cited yourself. A student has an evaluation with a counselor. And no law enforcement is involved. Students do not dismiss or suspend students, although sometimes there are suspensions that occur. And this is according to preventionnotpunishment.org in the United States. And I'll pass the mic.
I'll just go straight down the arguments. First is this idea of sporadic drug testing is good because it has an effectiveness. First of all, the only statistic provided in the round is on my side, where I tell you that 1 in every 125 drug tests actually results in a positive test, and we spend $3,000 for getting 1 positive result. Insofar as there isn't any evidence brought up on your side that drug testing is effective, I find the idea that it encourages students to use harder drugs the most prevalent idea in the round. Because simply saying that leading more drug testing will somehow stopping hard drugs sounds good in theory, but until you have any evidence to back that up, we go with what's happening in the status quo, where we saw 117 schools, 47% amount of drug use of hard drugs went up. Then this idea of $22,000 should come from a federal program, right? That would make sense But the problem is that Christopher Ingham specifically cites the idea that because mandatory drug testing is conducted by the school themselves, it directly comes out of their budget, where he predominantly found that they cut extracurriculars in the form of getting that funding to go towards the drug testing. So that $22,000 is directly being cut out of a stipend that goes towards extracurriculars. And that's a problem because extracurriculars have a far more lasting benefit to students than the mandatory drug testing. And this goes to the idea of an SRO has to be hired if a school wants to conduct mandatory drug testing, as you previously mentioned. The problem with this is that an SRO in school, a student resource officer, it decreases the amount of educational atmosphere by 8% in 47 schools that were surveyed that had to implement an SRO in California. And the reason why this occurs is students no longer believe that they're in a safe learning environment, but rather in a environment where they are being targeted. And the problem is that these drug tests are random. But there's an even more important study where it found that students who were drug tested that were in fact came back negative still had a negative impact on their overall learning because they felt that they were being targeted by the school. And this is more of a psychological theory and not so much quantified by results, because of the fact that it's students' perception that while they're under the age of 18, they're being targeted by a school and no longer have the same kind of relationships because they know there's someone hired in the school that their sole job is to make sure that students get suspended and punished for using drugs. And just getting that test itself is a negative impact to students. But then we go to this idea that random drug testing is only part of the solution. As cited by Bush, in 5 years, you said that we had an overall increase. Again, this goes back to your original argument where you can't just say that drug testing occurred along with extracurriculars and other things, and then we saw a decrease in the amount of drug use. The thing is that you need to show causation and not correlation. You need to directly show the effectiveness of uniquely random drug testing. And without that, there's no reason for the United States to make this mandatory for every single school.
All right, so you are correct. It is indeed fact time. So, well, some 16, and this is all according to the National Center for Education Evaluation Regional Assistance, a link that I can post below. Some 16% of students subject to drug testing reported substances covered by their district testings in the past 30 days, compared with 22% of comparable students and students without the program were reported using these substances. And also, this finding found that there was no evidence that the drug testing reduced students' participation in extracurricular activities or affected their connection to the school, which is something you just brought up. So there you go. There's a factual report by the National Center for Education Evaluation Regional Assistance carried out by the United States. By the U.S. government, sorry. So in addressing the $22,000 thing, just like I said the last round, we don't want to get rid of extracurriculars. That's not what I'm arguing. What needs to happen is the United States needs to provide this as an extra subsidy for the schools, or come from a federal or a state level, or maybe a partnership between the two. I know that in Canada, where I live, when it comes to funding for schools, it's a federal and provincial joint effort. What can happen in the United States is that we have this joint effort for something that would need to be, carried out through Congress, or even at the state Congress levels. And then you were thinking, or you're saying the fact that students think that there's this idea that someone is out to get them. If they do think that in particular cases, there definitely needs to be a message change, or a different way to address that and change the messaging of what's going on with the officer that is there. But like this, like the evidence that I provided, there's no evidence that affected their connection to the school, according to this recent study. So. And this study did find that it was successful, as I say, with the 16 to 22%, for them to not use substances as much as the people that were not subject to the randomized drug testing. So, and there was also another fact of this sort of report. In the 1 year period study, there was no evidence of any spillover effects to students that were not subject to testing. So, the fact is that this testing that's carried out affects the schools that it's at, and affects it effectively and well, according to the study. And this study is called The Effectiveness of Mandatory Random Drug Student Testing. It can be found on their website. And I will pass the mic.
As you will probably realize as soon as you look at this article again, and as you just stated, the problem with this is a theory found by Beth McCain, and that's the idea that the Department of Education, as well as the National Center for Drug Abuse, will publish these results as soon as possible, usually within a 1-year time period. So I'm sure if you go back to the study that you just Googled, you'll find that the results were published within a year of the data being collected. And the reason why the National Center of Drugs has done this repeatedly is because of the idea that these are long-term harms. So specifically with the student resource officer, Beth McCain found that over a 5-year period, it was far better to analyze the effects in schools because it was a thing that happened over a period of time. The problem is the National Center of Drug Abuse has identified this, and that's why they go to rush out the statistics as fast as possible, because it makes a lot of sense that if you immediately implement a drug policy and you see, comparing 22 to 16% is a 6% reduction in drug use, which is by no means a significant amount. That could be correlative over a 1-year period of time. Like the amount of students using drugs could go down, I could say almost very 15%, go back up 20%, down 25, right? Like that's a small number that doesn't show the actual effects of drug abuse. But the reason why they wanted to do this immediately is because you're not actually seeing the effect of the SRO. All you're seeing is the difference in the amount of drug use being created. So I would challenge you to find a statistic that looks over this over a long period of time, because the problem of looking at the short period of time is exactly what the U.S. Department of Education wants you to do. They want you to think of the idea that as soon as you implement drug policies, you have results. Well, that might make sense, but in the long term, you're going to have a negative effect on the school atmosphere, and that's found in more studies that are carried over a longer period of time. And in this speech, I want to extend the idea that's really important is on this idea of hard drugs. And the causal link that happens directly because of mandatory drug testing is the idea that as soon as you know drug testing is happening in your school, you know using softer drugs makes you more at risk of being punished because it's in your body for 10 times longer amount of time, 29 days versus 2.7. And the problem is that direct statistic that said the amount of hard drug use went up by 47% in the 117 surveyed schools. So what we see is that even in the study carried out by the National Center, if 6% of students are using less drugs, that's great. But we saw a 47% increase in the amount of hard drugs. And that far outweighs your impact because we saw 41 related incidents directly related to hard drugs. And that was only because mandatory drug testing was implemented. So that goes on to show that even if you can prove a 6% decrease, which won't be quantified long term, you still see far worse impacts in the status quo of the students that we're trying to help.
Okay, fantastic. So I'd just like to address the idea of sort of the short study time in the usage of mandatory drug testing currently. So just like a program like Obamacare that tries to address this issue of universal health care, unless something is fully implemented, it is not going to show any of the true effects of its full implementation. If the United States got universal health care, then the results would have to be accumulated once it fully occurred instead of this partial thing like the Affordable Care Act that attempts to head in that direction. And the same goes with this. Mandatory drug testing, if it was implemented fully, funded across all the public high schools in the United States, then you would have to see what would happen then. But the projections are, and according to the center, is that you would see, and other research that I've used, and also I've had this article for about a week now, so it's not just something I had or Googled right on the spot. And what you would see in the projections is that you would see sort of a move to a drug-free environment. And as we've seen in the past with ideologies, is the fact that once something becomes more standard and once something is more implemented, it's something that people get used to. So if students get used to having this drug testing going on, it's something that's part of their environment, even something that's cultural. Then you have this thing where the fear goes away. It's something that's regular. The same kind of happens with schools that implement things like metal detectors. Studies have shown that students kind of get used to it, and of course, these are things that protect students. And if you have this ideology, or if you have this messaging that's portrayed, then eventually that's going to start, impacting, is going to kind of catch on with anything that's kind of implemented over time. I guess I have an extra time after that part. Okay, sorry, I'm just looking at the time that I have. School administrators they have this mission. They are charged with having a safe, supportive, and healthy school environment where students can learn and reach their full potential. What student mandatory drug testing does is it's a deterrent, and if it was fully implemented, you have this deterring at short-term and long-term drugs, as you mentioned, the harder and softer, and it really is for the greater good. And once this becomes implemented and becomes part of the system, it is something that students can feel safe, can feel good about.
All right, so with my final speech, I'll go down my main ideas. First is my opponent likes to use these rhetorical terms like for the greater good and get used to it. And rhetorical arguments are fine in philosophical debates, but this is a fairly quantifiable debate. What are the impacts of drug testing? And simply saying that students will get used to it and for the greater good, I don't think stands in a debate like this, where I provide plenty of statistics of the negative harms. So I'm going to give the clear voting reasons as to why you can negate today's resolution. First is the idea of hard drugs, which never really gets adequately addressed by my opponent. I directly state that when there is drug testing in a school, there has been a 47% increase in the amount of hard drug usage because students know it's in your body far less and they're far less likely to be targeted by a drug testing. And you saw 41 related incidences directly because of the mandatory drug testing. That in and of itself gives you a reason to vote con because you know there's a reason why drug testing and promoting harms in schools. But then the next big idea is this idea of extracurriculars. My opponent says that extracurriculars and drug testing can work hand in hand. But the problem with this is that drug testing, first of all, isn't effective. 1 in 125 times is it actually effective, and the cost per one positive test is $3,000. And this becomes problematic because you can extend Christopher Ingram, who tells you that you have to spend $22,000 on average per school for this. And he directly explains the idea that schools cut extracurricular programs to fund their drug testing. Governments just don't suddenly give you funds. This is directly schools cutting their extracurricular funds. And this is a problem because you can extend J. Dreyfus, who tells you that students who have extracurriculars are 57% more likely to drop out, 49% less likely to use drugs, and 27% less likely to get arrested. And that goes directly to my idea of an SRO. My opponent likes to use this idea that students are going to get used to it. I would say absolutely not. Schools that have used drug testing have to hire a student resource officer, which in the California schools surveyed saw an 8% decrease in student achievement related to the hiring of the SRO because students no longer feel like they're in a safe learning environment, but rather an environment where there is a person directly hired to make sure that they can suspend you or punish you for illicit activities. And that becomes a problem because you're no longer doing things for the greater good, but you are making students feel uncomfortable in their own school. And that is a fiduciary responsibility of the United States government to provide you a school that makes you feel safe. But it also goes on this idea of minorities, where I tell you that it's not more drug testing happening to minorities, it's that more minority students happen to be involved in drug usage, and as a result, they're more likely to be suspended, which directly leads to the school to prison pipeline, because when students get suspended, they have far more reason to drop out. But insofar as you see the reasons that we don't use rhetoric in this debate, but we use the idea of hard drugs, extracurriculars, student resource officers, and minorities being adversely impacted, I see a
So to just kind of move to this, President George Bush set a 2-year goal of reducing drug use in youth by 10%. Reducing use by 25%. Randomized drug testing, mandatory drug testing was used with this, and 2-year and 5-year goals were met according to preventionnotpunishment.org. This issue of funds from the United States is something that is an issue with the education system as a whole, and through my argument, I think that the United States should implement more or should set aside more money for this. It does work in tandem with extracurriculars, and as I stated from this study from the center, that it did not implement students using extracurriculars, so that should still be effective. And it is for the greater good. I would ask people that are voting to look at a system that has the potential to be something far greater than what it is now.
Thanks.